Thanks everybody, and thanks so much for inviting me here again this year. I was at last year's conference and we had a fantastic discussion then, and I'm really pleased to see so many people at today's conference. It's quite clear to me that there's widespread support and excitement for the cooperative sector, and I know many of the faces that are here today, and I've spoken to you about some of the great work that you're doing, and hopefully if you get the chance today, please don't hesitate to grab me on the way out, or if you can't grab me, make an appointment and grab a coffee in my office maybe one Thursday or Friday, because it'd be great to sit down and just really get a feel for every single thing that's happening in my region in terms of cooperatives. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in this room that the seeds of the cooperative movement began just down the road from here, when the Rochdale pioneers opened their shop at 31 Toad Lane in 1844. Now, those 28 pioneers set out the principles which would determine the operation of cooperatives and the ideals of the cooperative movement for centuries to come. And since then, our movement has grown and grown. According to Co-op UK's 2017 report, there are now almost 7,000 independent co-ops across the UK, with over 13 million members and 226,000 employees. Now, this is an immense achievement, but I don't want to depress everybody, but I think we need to go a lot further than this, and that's why Labour has put cooperatives right at the heart of our manifesto. Now, why have we done this? Well, Britain's GDP productivity rate is 18% lower than the G7 average, and productivity growth has not been this bad since just after the Napoleonic Wars. Real wages haven't grown this slowly since the Second World War. Now, this isn't bad. This is unprecedented, and it shows us that there are deep structural problems within our economy and the way it's been run. And I won't go off on my crisis of capitalism speech that I sometimes do, but we know the story. We know that there was a change in economic thought in the early 1980s that saw a shift away from common ownership and the promotion of the cooperative movement towards a small sector in the southeast where a lot of emphasis was put on financial services, and there wasn't any diversity encouraged within business at all, and no mention at all of the co-op sector. Now, alongside this, we also saw a culture of short-termism developing corporate governance, making a quick buck emerging rather than investing for the long term. Now, if you look back in 1950, the average period of share ownership in the UK and the US was 6 years. Today it's 6 months. And that doesn't even take into account what we see, when you look at, the Wolf of Wall Street and programs like that, where we have high frequency trading, where it doesn't even happen on the floor of Wall Street or the stock exchange. It happens on a computer in a matter of seconds. Some organisations hold shares for a matter of seconds. Now, how can they productively be making decisions about the long-term interests of a company and its employees if they themselves have no real long-term interest in that company? Now, we know that this dramatic turn of events means that shareholders are less likely to make those long-term investments that will lead to longer growth, not just for that particular company, but for our overall productivity as a nation. But alongside this corporate culture, we've also seen inequality booming at a rate that we've not really seen since the Victorian era. And I know that many of you feel that in your communities. You'll have seen how bad it's getting for people out there. Now, Friday's my day that I visit my constituents and have meetings and surgeries. And I've got a member of my staff in the audience today, and I've been an MP now for nearly 3 years, and in that 3 years we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of people coming to visit me who are on the edge, who are desperate, and many of these people are in work. They're in work that pays so little, they can't afford to pay their rent, they can't afford to pay their bills, and they're being forced to rely on food banks. And in one of the richest nations in the world, this is a national scandal. Now, it's not only income, wealth and inequality that's booming, but it's also the growth in insecure work and the perils of the gig economy. You'll have heard of the horrific story of a guy called Don Lane, who recently died. He was a DPD gig worker. Theoretically, he was self-employed, but I think if you legally look at his case, he had all the hallmarks of what should have been an employee. Now, he was fined by his employer for going to an urgent doctor's appointment, and he became so frightened after that about taking further time off to go to medical appointments that he didn't. And sadly, he passed away. And his family have suggested that the stress that was, imposed on him by that period of employment would have contributed to his untimely passing. And that was absolutely horrific. Now, the government had the opportunity to address this. They published their response to the Taylor Review. I don't know if many of you heard, but a gentleman called Matthew Taylor did a review into modern working practices across the UK not so long ago. Now, we, as a Labour Party, we said that it might have had some of the right rhetoric in there, but it didn't go far enough to tackle the problems in the gig economy, and it certainly didn't tackle one of the root causes, which is ownership within companies and an employee stake within their company to ensure that they have adequate protections and a right to a quality working life. Now, according to the TUC, there are 3.2 million people in insecure work. That's 1/10 of the entire UK workforce. And what many people don't see and don't understand is that these issues have their roots in the current system structures of ownership, failing corporate governance, and inadequate employment protections. But if we just stop for a minute and imagine what the world could be like. Imagine if the technology that allows us to hail a taxi or order a takeaway via an app was actually shared on those who rely on it for work rather than controlling them. They'd have the power to agree their own terms and conditions, rates of pay, with the profits being shared amongst them or reinvested in that business for the future. Now, imagine if workers could determine the pay of their own executives, their chief executives. And we wouldn't have had incidents like on the 4th of January this year, where it was Fat Cat Thursday, where FTSE 100 bosses in the first 4 days of January had earned more than the average UK salary. Now, imagine if the direction of a company was decided by the workers who had a long-term interest in that company's success. They weren't just speculators trying to make a quick buck. There'd be no more Philip Greens sailing off into the sunset on their super yachts whilst people's pension funds are decimated, that's for sure. And what I'm trying to say, and I know that, I'd be surprised if there was anybody who put a red card up at this point. Putting power in the hands of the people is a fundamental tool in creating an economy that works for the many, not the few. It's not just about distributing wealth. It's about making sure that the control of that wealth is addressed as well. Now, one way of doing that is through supporting the cooperative sector. And John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, has already pledged that the next Labour government would introduce a right to own, offering employees first refusal on firms which are changing hands. And we also said in our manifesto last year that we'd aim to double the size of the cooperative sector, which would be supported by our National Investment Bank and regional development banks. We also advocated community wealth building programmes to promote local cooperatives and businesses. We also looked at the Preston model, a way of harnessing our local wealth and making sure that that local wealth through anchor institutions is used to procure services from local cooperatives and those organisations that deliver a real economic and social benefit to our communities. However, we also recognise that the next Labour government needs not to just encourage new cooperatives, but we've got to make it easier for cooperatives to grow. Now, the Alternative Models of Ownership report published last year highlighted some of the hurdles cooperatives face. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, do go on the Labour Party website and have a read of it. It's about 50 pages long, and it's a good nighttime read before bed. It gives you a lot of examples about cooperatives, but it also looks at things such as the Preston model and municipal ownership and all the different possible permutations that you can think about. And when I talk to because I go to speak at business events as well, and I talk about there's a real need to diversify business ownership. It's promoting the cooperative sector, but it's also looking at things that we might not have thought about before that empower workers and empower local communities to deliver their own services and have a real stake in their economic future. Now, some of the hurdles that we identified were access to finance through conventional institutions, the ability of workers to buy out their company, and lack of protection from potential buyouts by private companies. And last weekend, we had a great conference in London. We had an Alternative Models of Ownership conference to explore how we can explore the ideas contained within that report. And when the next general election is called, set out a clear roadmap to the booming creation of more cooperatives to a level that many of us will have never seen in our lifetime. Now, John announced the commissioning of a new report to investigate the legislative changes needed to clear away these hurdles and to allow the cooperative sector to flourish. And this report is commissioned by the New Economics Foundation, working with the Cooperative Party, and it's aimed to give a detailed analysis of the current cooperative sector, a vision for substantial growth, and actions that policymakers would need to take to realise this vision. And we expect that to be a real consultation with yourselves so that you can have an input into that report. You can tell us what your real life examples have been, what your hurdles have been, and what you would like to see in terms of support for the co-op sector in the future. Now, we also announced that working with the Co-op Party, an expert group of activists and cooperators will be brought together to form an implementation group which would engage with the cooperative movement, road test ideas and provide feedback. Now, I know that there are probably a number of questions that you want to ask, or you might want to kind of let me know what your potential policy ideas are, so I won't talk for too much longer other than to say that our cooperatives embody a forgotten truth about the world. Wealth is created collectively, not by some small minority group, but by workers, the community. When we talk, sadly, about wealth creators, however, we don't mean those people who created the wealth in the first instance. It usually means the wealth controllers and the wealth owners. But we know the reality is that the resources of our world are created collectively, and we want that to be reflected in the way our wealth is owned and managed. And that is why we are dedicated to expanding the co-op sector and making sure that in the future we all feel that we have a real stake in our economic future. And then I'll just end on this point. There's a lot of talk about the fourth industrial revolution, because one of my other hats is industrial strategy. Now, this is a pace of technological change that we have never experienced in our lifetime. Even the lowest skilled jobs over the next 10 years will require an immense level of expertise. And yes, we will see certain jobs in some sectors eradicated. Now, as a Labour Party, we recognise that our economy isn't there for us to be servants to the economy. The economy is there to provide us with quality of life. So if we want to ensure that we benefit from the qualities of life that further automisation and digitisation can bring in terms of increasing productivity in businesses and cooperatives, that's fantastic. But we also want it to increase quality of life. And to do that, we need to make sure that workers have more of a stake in how their companies are run. Now we talk about the dream. Harold Wilson did the White Heat of Technology speech many decades ago, and he talked about this quality of life principle, and he talked about the then Industrial Revolution, which was a complete revolution in manufacturing, where people were worried that the machines were coming to take jobs. And he said this is an opportunity that we need to embrace. Why can't we use this as an opportunity to mean that people have less working hours, they have more leisure time, they spend more time on the quality pursuits such as art and drama and reading and music and the things that make us whole as a person, because we don't just live to work, we work to live, and we need to recognise that. So thank you very much again for having me today. It's been a real pleasure, and if anybody's got any questions or any suggestions, then please don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you.